Okay, let's dive in. We got this fascinating stack of sources today sent in by a listener, and at first glance, they seem to cover worlds apart. On one side, we're looking at the incredible pomp and intricate ceremony of European coronations, centuries of tradition, cloaked in gold and ritual.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other side, we're plunging into a really deep, sometimes uh, uncomfortable historical analysis of the Indian caste system.
Yeah.
We've got Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's groundbreaking work here, focusing on the Shudras and the complex, painful origins of untouchability. It's quite a contrast.
It really is. We're going from like the absolute heights of societal elevation through ritual down to the depths of exclusion and degradation based purely on birth.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to wade through these sources. We've got Wikipedia excerpts, some great material from historical associations covering medieval and modern coronations, and then these extensive, very detailed passages from Dr. Ambedkar's critical writings.
Quite a range.
It is. And what we want to do is pull out the most important insights, the details that maybe surprise you, the facts that challenge settled history, as they say, and see if we can uncover any unexpected connections or, stark contrast in how societies across huge divides of time and culture have grappled with these basic human questions. How do we define status? Who belongs? Who gets the power? And how is all that legitimized and kept going?
It's really about understanding the powerful, often kind of invisible mechanisms societies use to order themselves, whether that order involves putting one person on a throne through sacred rites or pushing entire groups to the margins through denial and taboo.
Precisely. So let's start with that elevated end of the spectrum. The sources give us a pretty clear picture of European coronations. It's a tradition that feels incredibly ancient, doesn't it? Steeped in very specific actions and symbols.
It does. Looking at the Wikipedia source here, it defines the core ceremony with three fundamental elements that seem pretty consistent across different traditions: the anointing, the enthronement, and the investiture. These aren't just random steps. They're like the symbolic foundation of actually becoming a monarch.
And the sources suggest that by the 12th century, particularly in places like England and the Holy Roman Empire, these parts had really sort of solidified. They reached a degree of standardization. It wasn't quite as maybe fluid anymore. The blueprint for the ritual was largely set.
Which tells us something important, doesn't it? By that point, the ritual itself had become a critical, recognized part of legitimizing the monarch. It wasn't maybe enough just to inherit the title. You needed that ceremonial confirmation.
Okay, so let's look at specifics. The historical association material gives us this fascinating early glimpse with Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. She was crowned empress alongside her husband Henry V back in 1117 at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome.
A big deal, geographically and politically. But the source adds this really intriguing note that it happened under dubious circumstances.
Dubious? How so?
Well, they were actually crowned by an anti-pope, Gregory VIII. He was later excommunicated by the legitimate pope. So the whole thing was questionable from the established church's perspective.
Ah, okay. So religiously shaky ground. But here's the interesting part, right? The source says that despite all this, Matilda kept using the title Empress for the rest of her life. And the chroniclers at the time, they largely accepted it.
Which really shows that while the ritual's legitimacy, especially from the religious side, was important, the political reality, the acceptance by key figures in contemporary society that also played a massive role in validating that status, the title stuck, even with that cloud over the ceremony.
And there's something else curious the source notes about Matilda. Her multiple coronations, presumably including times in England, apparently got little attention from chroniclers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it suggests that even within that royal world, not all coronations were treated equally. Some just weren't seen as momentous or maybe worthy of detailed historical record. Some were just more politically charged or symbolically significant than others, perhaps.
That's a good reminder, isn't it? History isn't just a straightforward recording of events. It's shaped by what people at the time chose to focus on, what narratives they wanted to reinforce.
Definitely. Okay, zooming in on British coronations specifically, the sources trace this lineage way, way back. They mention King Edgar, who reigned from 959 to 975. And get this. Queen Elizabeth II attended a celebration in 1973, marking the millennium of his coronation in Bath Abbey.
Wow, 1,000 years. 1,000 years of continuity in a core ritual. That really underscores the deep roots and the sense of historical tradition that this ceremony embodies for the British monarchy.
And it's not just about the monarch, is it? The sources highlight these other historical roles involved, showing this intricate web of traditional obligations tied to the coronation. There's the Earl Marshal, for instance.
Right, which is a hereditary office held by the Duke of Norfolk.
Still hereditary today.
Yes, quite remarkably, a survival of a feudal title and responsibility right inside a modern state ceremony. And the source even points out, interestingly, that the current Duke of Norfolk, despite being Catholic, can still perform these duties because of an act passed way back in 1824.
That's fascinating. Okay, then there's the Court of Claims. This dates all the way back to Richard II, 1377. And its sole purpose, apparently, was to decide who had the right to perform certain traditional services during the coronation.
Think about that. They needed a dedicated court just to sort out who got to do what historical task. It speaks volumes about how embedded these specific traditional roles were and how they were considered valuable, almost like property, requiring legal arbitration based on centuries of precedent.
Yeah.
And the source is careful to point out this is totally distinct from, say, the U.S. Court of Claims. Its purpose is unique, tied only to the coronation.
And maybe the most visually striking of these roles mentioned in the source, the King's Champion.
Oh yeah, that one's amazing. Traditionally from the Daimok family, this figure would ride into Westminster Hall in full armor, throw down a gauntlet 3 times, and challenge anyone who disputed the monarch's right to the throne.
Wow. Talk about theater.
It's almost theatrical, yeah, but deeply symbolic, right? A display of the monarch's readiness to defend their position, relying on these ancient, often hereditary roles to play out the drama of legitimacy.
The sources also show how the ceremony wasn't like totally static. It could intersect with specific political and religious realities. They mention the Scottish claim of Right Act 1689 and the particular Scottish coronation oath sworn by William and Mary.
Right, and that oath, as outlined in the source, included a clause about rooting out heretics.
Oof.
Yeah. But the source tells us that William and Mary actually questioned this. They pushed back. It shows they weren't just passively receiving a script, they were actively engaging with the terms of the ritual, questioning aspects that didn't fit their maybe political or religious outlook.
So it wasn't just performing a rite, it was partly a political and religious negotiation sort of encoded in the ceremony itself.
Exactly. The ritual was reflecting the power dynamics between the monarch, the church, and this evolving idea of a more limited, constitutionally bound monarchy.
Okay, let's break down the symbolic core of the service itself, as described in the sources. There seem to be 4 main parts, each with its own historical weight. The first one is the recognition.
Yeah, and the source traces this all the way back to the ancient Wittin.
The Anglo-Saxon Council of Wise Men.
That's the one, the precursor to Parliament, essentially. So this is the initial moment where the monarch is formally presented to the assembled representatives of the realm. And historically, they'd give their assent, their approval. It's about acknowledging the monarch's right to rule by the people's representatives, in a way.
Okay. Then comes the oath, which is presented as like a contract between the monarch and the people.
Right. And the sources give us the specific wording for Charles III's oath. It notes it includes a promise to govern the peoples according to their respective laws and customs.
Respective laws and customs. That phrasing seems significant.
It really is. It acknowledges the multinational nature of the UK and the realms, doesn't it? Moving beyond just one set of laws to recognize the diverse legal and cultural traditions within the Union. It's updating that ancient idea of a reciprocal promise for a more modern, diverse context.
Makes sense. Okay, third element, the anointing, often seen as the most sacred part, representing consecration by the Church of England.
Absolutely. The sources give us little glimpses of this, mentioning an image caption of George V shortly before his anointing, and noting the Dean of Westminster's really emotional response to being present at that moment for Charles III. He found it deeply moving.
I can imagine.
It's an act steeped in biblical tradition, isn't it? Setting the monarch apart, making them chosen or sanctioned by God, a sort of sacred figure within the realm. The Dean's reaction just highlights the profound spiritual significance still attached to this act for those involved.
And the fourth part is the investiture and crowning. This is where the monarch actually receives the specific symbols of office, the regalia, culminating in the physical act of placing the crown on their head.
Yeah, the big moment. This is the culmination, the visible, physical point when the monarch takes on the full authority and responsibility symbolized by all those objects of state.
And finally, there's the homage. The source describes this as a survival from feudal times. It's where the lord's spiritual and temporal, so the bishops and archbishops, and the peers like dukes, marquesses, earls, viscounts, barons pay homage.
And it's explicitly noted, isn't it, that members of parliament, the elected representatives, they do not pay homage in this ceremony.
Interesting distinction.
It remains a ritual focused on that historical relationship between the crown and the hereditary peerage and the church hierarchy, though the way it's done has changed. Since 1902, apparently, it shifted from every single peer paying homage individually, which must have taken ages,
Oh, definitely.
to only the senior peer in each order paying homage on behalf of their rank.
Much more practical.
Yeah, and it shifts the symbolism slightly too, maybe. From individual fealty to a representation of the peerage as a collective body paying homage. The source gives the example of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, paying homage to his father George V in 1911. A very personal moment, but embedded within this formal historical structure.
Speaking of symbols, the regalia itself is just steeped in history. The sources suggest Edward the Confessor, way back when 1042 to 1066, might have been the one to first assemble a collection at Westminster Abbey.
Right, but much of that original collection, well, it was lost to history, or more accurately destroyed. The source tells us Oliver Cromwell ordered the destruction of a significant amount of the regalia in 1649 during the English Civil War.
A very deliberate act, wasn't it? Symbolically dismantling the monarchy and its power.
Absolutely. But then, after the Restoration, when Charles II came back, a lot of it had to be remade for his coronation in 1661.
Including some of the most famous pieces we still see today.
Exactly. Like the orb and St. Edward's crown. And the source adds this fascinating detail. St. Edward's crown, the one used for the actual crowning moment, was a restoration gift from Parliament.
Huh. So even in the symbols of the monarch's ultimate authority, you see the fingerprint of that evolving power dynamic with Parliament.
You do. The sources list other specific items used too. The scepter, the rod, the coronation glove, and the armil, which is a kind of stole or bracelet. For Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, the armil was actually a significant gift from the Commonwealth nations.
Showing that connection.
Yeah, each of these objects carries layers of symbolism representing different aspects of royal power, justice, mercy, connection, not just to the UK, but increasingly to that wider family of nations.
And then there's the Stone of Destiny. The source mentions its transfer from Scotland to London for Charles III's coronation, noting this involved working closely with the Scottish government and historic environment, Scotland.
Ah, yes, the Stone of Scone. Ancient, deeply symbolic for Scotland, with a very complex history, having been taken by English monarchs centuries ago. Its use in the British coronation has been a point of contention for a long time.
And still is.
Oh, yes. The source notes that during the lead-up to Charles III's coronation, an S&P leadership contender actually backed calls to stop its use in the ceremony. It just illustrates how even these ancient, shared symbols remain points of contemporary political debate about national identity and sovereignty.
Right. Okay, let's shift to the practicalities and, well, controversies around modern coronations. The sources give us some insight into how these events scale and how they're viewed today. They mention George VI increasing seats for his 1937 coronation, and Elizabeth II's in 1953 being just massive, over 8,000 guests from 129 nations.
Huge. In contrast, Charles III's coronation in 2023 was significantly smaller, just over 2,200 guests. The source described it as being more like a royal wedding in size.
Interesting comparison.
And it also highlights a shift in the guest list. It included community and charity champions alongside the traditional roster of royalty and heads of state.
That feels like a deliberate move, doesn't it? Trying to make the ceremony feel a bit more representative of modern Britain, acknowledging contributions beyond the usual elites.
It does seem like a subtle evolution of the guest list, yeah, reflecting a broader spectrum of society, while still, of course, maintaining the hierarchical structure of the event itself.
The costs and public funding also came under scrutiny for 2023. The source mentions figures like £840,000 specifically for public screenings and notes the controversy around government funding versus public opinion polling on the matter.
Yeah, these large-scale state events, especially in times of economic pressure, they inevitably spark debate about the use of public money. The inclusion of YouGov poll data in the source really highlights how public sentiment is factored into that discussion now.
And as you'd expect with major national events like this, there were protests and significant security measures. The source points to anti-monarchist protests, chants like "Not My King," and details a massive police deployment, 11,500 officers for Charles III's coronation, described as the Met Police's biggest single deployment ever.
Wow. That scale of police presence plus the organized protests, it just underscores that even a ritual designed to unify and legitimize authority is also a focal point for dissent, for expressing alternative political views about the state. The fact that the Home Secretary and Culture Secretary were briefed on intelligence reports shows the level of state concern about potential disruption.
The media coverage was obviously extensive. Sources mentioned plans by BBC, Sky News, even an album recording of the event.
Of course. The media acts as that vital conduit, doesn't it? Transforming a localized physical ceremony into a national and global event, shared and consumed by millions far beyond Westminster Abbey.
Other details in the sources point to the evolving nature of the ceremony, too. New shares were made for Charles III blue velvet with their ciphers, and the plan was to auction them for charity afterwards. The source notes that making new thrones is actually standard practice.
That's a small but interesting detail, isn't it? Blending tradition, new seating for the monarch with modern sensibilities, like a charitable outcome, maybe a nod to sustainability.
The robes worn were also a mix. Traditional ones like the St. Edward's crown robe, the robe of state worn by previous monarchs. But for the peers attending Charles III's coronation, there was a notable shift. They wore either their parliamentary ermine robes or just business attire.
Oh, really? Business attire.
Yeah, and the source even mentions rumors beforehand about royal women possibly opting for flowers instead of tiaras.
Those shifts in attire, allowing business dress for peers, maybe a less formal headwear choice for royal women, they signal subtle but significant moves, perhaps towards a less overtly formal or hierarchical visual presentation compared to previous coronations.
Even the preparation sounds immense. The sources describe the armed forces practicing the intricate procession on a wide runway designed to mimic the streets perfectly. And the Dean of Westminster noting he was surprisingly calm, despite the huge responsibility of his role in the core ceremony.
The level of logistical planning, the rehearsals, it just highlights the importance placed on executing this complex historical ritual absolutely flawlessly, given its immense symbolic weight in that global audience.
Finally, the sources touch on the processions to and from the Abbey, designed to be visible to the public, and historical post-coronation events like that massive review of the fleet for Elizabeth II's coronation, 190 vessels, over 300 aircraft.
Wow, a powerful display of naval and air power, reflecting the monarch's role as head of the armed forces and, the nation's global reach at that time.
But things change.
They do. The sources also note that the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association apparently felt that a large coronation luncheon, like the ones held in 1937 and 1953, would not necessarily be appropriate now. Another sign of how the event adapts, or at least how its elements are debated, in light of changing global relationships and priorities.
So pulling all of this together, it's clear these European coronation rituals stretching back centuries, involving specific objects, roles, precise actions, they're powerful engines designed to legitimize and display royal authority. Queen Victoria's personal journal entry about her own coronation really captures the intended impact, doesn't it? Describing it as the most beautiful, impressive moment and the proudest of my life.
It's a system built to take an individual and, through this series of complex symbolic acts, elevate them to a unique, almost sacred status, setting them apart from everyone else. It uses history, religion, ceremony, all of it, to build and project power.
Wow, okay, so that gives us a really deep look at how status, particularly royal status, is formally established, displayed through elaborate historical ritual in a European context. Now let's shift dramatically. Using our sources, let's look at a completely different social system and how status, or crucially, the lack of status, is defined and enforced. We're turning to the Indian caste system, particularly through the critical analysis of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar.
It's a really stark contrast, isn't it? Instead of ritual designed for inclusion and elevation to the very peak of the social pyramid, we're looking at a system built on inherent status determined by birth, and how ritual, or the denial of it, was used to maintain rigid boundaries and enforce profound exclusion.
Dr. Ambedkar, as presented in these sources, had a very clear, very powerful view of the caste system. He saw it as a sociological institution that resembled a corporation with an unchanging board of directors.
That analogy is incredibly insightful. It captures the essence of caste as this closed, hereditary system. Status isn't something you earned or achieve based on ability. It's fixed at birth, like inheriting a position on a corporate board. As the source quotes him directly, In theory and in practice, the caste is the opposite of liberty, antithesis of equality.
That's a fundamental condemnation right there. He saw these fixed, static class barriers as inherently oppressive, totally incompatible with the most basic principles of freedom and equality that he championed.
He even offered a parallel for the modern world, suggesting that in contemporary society, the priesthood is replaced by experts, forming a new kind of class or caste.
That's a provocative thought, isn't it? Suggesting that even in systems that claim to be based on merit or knowledge, you can still see the emergence of these entrenched, difficult-to-penetrate hierarchies, almost like modern-day castes based on specialized expertise.
And his proposed solution to these rigid hierarchies, whether traditional or modern, was radical yet simple, making knowledge free, widening practical social wisdom. He directly links this to his rationalist philosophy and the value of liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience.
So for Ambedkar, the antidote to these fixed social stratifications, the way to break down these walls is through the free flow of information, critical thinking, and the unimpeded pursuit of knowledge.
Precisely. Knowledge is the ultimate disruptor of rigid ascribed status.
Now, let's get into the heart of Ambedkar's historical analysis, which the sources emphasize as quite revolutionary. He puts forth this significant thesis. The Shudras, the fourth Varna, were not originally separate from the other three. They were, in fact, originally Kshatriyas.
Right. This is a direct challenge to the traditional, widely accepted narrative you find in many texts that Indo-Aryan society was structured into four distinct Varnas from the start: Brahmins, priest-teachers; Kshatriyas, warriors-rulers; Vaishyas, merchants-farmers; and Shudras, laborer-servants. Ambedkar argues no, there was a time with only three Varnas, and Shudras were part of the Kshatriya, the warrior-ruler class.
And he doesn't just state this. He provides some compelling evidence from the Rig Veda, one of the oldest sacred texts, and the Mahabharata epic. The sources point to the figure of Sudas Pajavana.
Sudas Pajavana. He's described in the Rig Veda as a Kshatriya king, even a mighty king. He's mentioned in, 27 places?
Yeah.
Which highlights his importance in that early period.
But then, Ambedkar points out, the Mahabharata calls this very same figure, Sudas, a Shudra.
And this discrepancy is absolutely central to Ambedkar's argument, as the source quotes him, capturing his, astonishment and excitement: a Shudra to be an Aryan, a Shudra to be a Kshatriya, and a Shudra to be a king. Can there be a greater revelation? Can there be anything more revolutionary?
Wow. That quote really drives home how this single fact for Ambedkar just completely shattered the idea of the Shudras always being the lowest Varna right from the beginning.
He argues that this degradation, this fall from Kshatriya status, happened as a result of a continuous feud between the Shudra kings and the Brahmins. He suggests that the Brahmins were subjected to many tyrannies and indignities by these kings.
So it wasn't just some abstract social hierarchy floating around. It was a dynamic historical power struggle between the priestly class and the ruling class, specifically those among the rulers who were later designated as Shudras.
Yes, and the sources link this conflict directly to the mechanism of their degradation. As a result of this intense hatred and conflict, the Brahmins, according to Ambedkar's analysis, refused to perform the Upanayana for the Shudras.
The denial of that crucial ritual again.
Exactly. The denial of Upanayana, the initiation ceremony, is presented as the specific act that cemented their fall. Because they were denied this ritual, these former Kshatriyas became socially degraded, falling below even the Vaishyas, and thus forming the distinct fourth Varna known as Shudras. The denial of the rite was effectively a social excommunication, permanently altering their place in the social order.
The sources also detail these broader historical conflicts between Brahmins and Kshatriyas, reinforcing the idea that this tension wasn't confined just to the Shudras.
Right. There's the famous long-standing enmity between Vasishtha, a prominent Brahmin priest, and Vishvamitra. Vishvamitra started as a Kshatriya royal lineage, but aspired to and eventually attained the status of a Brahmarishi, a sage of the highest order. He's even credited as the author of the sacred Gayatri mantra.
So a Kshatriya becoming a top-level sage.
Yes, and the source explicitly identifies their conflict as one between a Brahmin priest and a Kaichuo priest, highlighting the competition for religious authority and status. We hear about various stories like conflicts involving the Sarasvati River, or figures like Ambarisha and Shunashipa.
And the dramatic story of the Brigas, a priestly family, and the Kshatriya king Kritavirya.
That's the key one. The king had initially enriched the Brigas, but later his descendants demanded the wealth back. When the Brigas hid it, the Kshatriyas responded with brutal violence, killing members of the Brigu family.
That's incredibly violent.
It is. But then the story includes this strange reconciliation, where the Brigo ancestors apparently stated, perhaps mythologically, that they had desired to be slaughtered by the Kashiyas when they were old. It's a complex narrative, for sure, but the core is a violent clash between these status groups over resources and perceived rights.
Then there's another story involving Vasishta again, and a king named Kalmashapada, also called Sarusa. The king is cursed, about to devour Vasishta in a fit of madness.
But Vasishta intervenes, removes the curse, and even agrees to help the king by begetting an heir for him. And in return, the king makes a crucial promise.
Which is?
The source notes the king's promise to never condemn the Brahmins. Again, this narrative, embedded in the text, reinforces the idea of Brahminical power, even over royalty, securing deference through a story of intervention and obligation.
And finally, the story of Nuhusha, a king who mythologically attained the sovereignty of the gods themselves. But he challenged the authority of Brahmana texts on sacrifice and, unforgivably, touched the head of the sage Axtia with his foot.
The ultimate disrespect. For this challenge to sacred authority and disrespect to a sage, Nahusha was cursed by the rishis, the sages, to fall from his divine position and become a serpent for 10,000 years.
Wow.
This tale powerfully illustrates the Brahmins defending the supreme authority of their sacred texts and their own spiritual status, using their power to punish even a king who had ascended to the heavens. These conflicts, detailed in the sources, they paint a picture of a dynamic, often contentious history between the priestly and warrior classes, fundamentally shaping the Varna system.
Let's return to the Upanayana ceremony because its denial is so central to Ambedkar's argument about the Shudras. The sources explain Upanayana as the ceremony that initiates a person into the study of the Vedas, the sacred texts.
Right. It was effectively a rite of passage, a kind of second birth. For the first three, Varnas Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, making them twice-born Trivarnikas, it granted them the right to learn and participate in Vedic rituals.
And the sources get quite detailed about the symbol of this initiation, the sacred thread, or yajnopavita. They describe its composition, 3 threads, 9 strands called tantus, rules about its length to the navel, even different ways of wearing it, nivita, upavita, prasinavita, depending on the context.
These specific details, while they might sound like minutiae, were incredibly significant. The 9 strands, for example, were sometimes said to represent various deities. Scholars like Mr. Tilak offer explanations linking it to constellations like Orion, Pajapati. And Ambedkar suggested it might have originally been about tying oneself to a particular gotra, a lineage group.
But whatever the exact symbolism.
Exactly. Possessing and wearing the thread was a clear visual marker of status and eligibility for sacred knowledge.
And, as the sources emphasize repeatedly, Upanayana was denied to the Shudras. But this is where Ambedkar presents his crucial evidence that this denial wasn't always the case, suggesting their exclusion was a later development.
This evidence is key to his argument that the Shudras' low status wasn't original. The sources cite ancient laws, found in texts like the Apastamba Dharma Sutra and Vasishtha Dharma Sutra. These laws actually allowed for Upanayana to be performed for individuals who had missed it. For some reason, they were called Patita Saviska after undergoing a specific penance.
So there were mechanisms for readmission, even for those who had somehow fallen outside the practice.
Apparently so. Even the son of such a person could have the ceremony performed. The sources also mention that Upanayana was permitted for groups called Vratyas. Now, there's scholarly debate, noted in the sources, about who exactly Vratyas were, maybe Aryans who had neglected the rite, or maybe non-Aryans being converted into the social fold.
But the very fact that there was discussion and allowance for Upanayana for groups like this, it complicates the idea of a permanently closed system right from the start, doesn't it?
It really does. And perhaps the most astonishing piece of evidence the sources provide against the idea of strict Varna-based denial from the very beginning is found in the Bodhayana text. It apparently allowed Upanayana even for an asvatha tree.
Wait, a tree? They performed the Upanayana ceremony for a tree.
The sources state this: if this sacred initiation rite could be performed, even symbolically, for an inanimate object like a tree in certain ritual contexts, well, it makes the argument for its absolute inherent restriction based solely on Varna from the dawn of time much, much weaker.
That's a powerful piece of counter-evidence.
Another point the sources bring up is the comparison to Indo-Iranians. They're closely related to Indo-Aryans in culture and religion, and among them, men and women of all classes were invested with a sacred thread, similar to the Yajnopavita. Ambedkar, through the sources, basically challenges his opponents. Prove why Indo-Aryans would have been fundamentally different from the very beginning.
So this whole collection of evidence, the laws for Mistupanayana, the Vratyas, the Treat, the Indo-Iranian comparison, it strongly supports Ambedkar's thesis that the denial of Upanayana to Shudras was a historical development, likely linked to that Brahmin conflict with them, rather than an original feature of the Varna system.
It completely undermines the idea of a static, four-Varna structure present from day one, and reinforces his argument that the Shudras' status was the result of a historical process of degradation.
The sources also touch on how complex these Varna definitions were in the real world, leading to legal challenges. They mention the difficulty in classifying groups like Kayastas, a literary caste, as simply Shudras, noting Justice Mahamud's doubts and specific court cases where their status was debated.
Right. This shows that the theoretical Varna system, as rigid as it might appear on paper, faced practical difficulties and legal challenges when applied to actual social groups whose status didn't fit neatly into that fourfold division. It wasn't a perfectly smooth, universally accepted system on the ground.
And we see this contestation so vividly in the case study of Shivaji's coronation in the 17th century.
Ah, Shivaji. A powerful founder of the Maratha Empire. He was regarded as a Shudra by some influential Brahmins of the time. And this was a huge problem because, according to the strict interpretation of tradition, only a Kshatriya could be a legitimate king performing Vedic coronation rites, and that required having undergone Upanayana.
So his Kshatriya status was questioned, and therefore his very right to a Vedic coronation.
Precisely.
Mm.
The sources detail the role of Gagapat, a prominent Brahmin scholar from Benares who was brought in. He eventually certified Shivaji as a Kshatriya, tracing him to a specific lineage, and performed both the Upanayana and the coronation ceremony.
But the sources add a fascinating, almost scandalous detail here. Gagapad reportedly wrote a treatise, the Gagabati, specifically claiming that Kayastas, who were often rivals or associated with record-keeping administrations, sometimes holding positions of power, were actually bastards.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That detail, as the source points out, just dramatically illustrates the politically charged nature of these status questions. Brahmins like Gagabet weren't just neutral arbiters of tradition. They could use their authority over textual interpretation and ritual to assert or deny status in ways that serve their own interests, or the interests of those who patronize them, like Shivaji.
And the source notes further complications around Gagapat's fee for the coronation, reportedly astronomical compared to Shivaji's own ministers' incomes. It also mentions that Balaji, Shivaji's Kayasta minister, sent a Kayasta representative to deal with Gagapat, not a Brahmin.
Highlighting internal caste dynamics, potential mistrust, strategic maneuvering even within Shivaji's own court. It's a really rich, detailed example showing the Varna system not as some static historical fact, but as a framework that was actively debated, contested, and manipulated in the pursuit of power and status.
So we've looked at how ritual, or its denial, was used to establish or degrade status within the Varna system, following Ambedkar's analysis of the Shudras. But he takes this even further, doesn't he? Proposing an altogether novel thesis on the origins of untouchability, which is an even deeper level of social exclusion.
This is perhaps Ambedkar's most challenging and original argument presented in these sources. His theory about how untouchability originated directly confronts widely held beliefs and historical interpretations.
He lays out several key propositions. The first one is maybe the most striking counterargument to any racial theories. He states there is no racial difference between Hindus, including the upper castes and the untouchables.
That's a direct refutation, isn't it, of any idea that untouchability arose because untouchables were some racially distinct, conquered indigenous population, different from Aryan invaders who became the upper castes.
And he backs this up with powerful evidence from, well, unimpeachable sources. He quotes Max Muller, the renowned philologist, directly stating, "Aryan is utterly inapplicable to race. It means language and nothing but language." Applying this term to different groups, Muller said, was about their language, not their physical features.
Muller even went further in a quote cited in the sources, stating that even the blackest Hindus represent an earlier stage of Aryan speech and thought than the fairest Scandinavians. This linguistic definition of Aryan just completely demolishes any attempt to build a theory of caste or untouchability on a foundation of physical or racial difference between groups in India.
The sources also present physical anthropology data collected by British census commissioners in India. And this is equally damning to racial theories, isn't it? They note the surprising lack of correspondence between social gradation or caste rank, including high castes like Brahmins, Kayastas, Marathas, and low castes like Churas, Chandals, Mahars, Sonkolis, and physical characteristics like head shape, hair type, skin color, stature across different regions.
The specific data points are incredibly compelling. For example, in the United Provinces, a Brahmin might show closer physical affinity to a Punjab Chua or Khatri than to some other castes within his own province.
Really?
Yeah. In Bengal, Chandals showed surprisingly little physical differentiation from Brahmins. In Bombay, a Deshasta Brahmin might be closer in physical type to a fisherman caste like the Sankolas than to his own Brahmin subcaste.
These are real measured data points that directly contradict any theory that the caste hierarchy, including the division between touchable and untouchable, is based on inherent, distinct racial types.
Absolutely. The scientific evidence, as presented by Ambedkar through these sources, simply does not support a racial origin for caste or untouchability.
Okay, so if it's not racial difference, what is Ambedkar's alternative theory for the origin of untouchability? He proposes the original distinction was between tribesmen who belonged to settled, integrated tribes and broken men from alien, often defeated or disrupted tribes.
Right. The theory is that in ancient tribal societies, conflicts were common. When a tribe was defeated or fragmented, some of its members, the broken men, would seek refuge with a neighboring settled tribe. They weren't fully integrated because of tribal differences, but they were allowed to live nearby, typically outside the main village boundary for security reasons, both the settled tribe protecting itself and the broken men grouping together for mutual protection.
And according to Ambedkar's thesis presented in the sources, it was these broken men who eventually became the untouchables.
This is a crucial distinction he makes. The sources emphasize that the untouchables lived outside the village from the very beginning, not because they were already considered untouchable and deported, but because they were broken men who belonged to a tribe different from the one to which the settled tribe belonged.
So the segregation came first, driven by intertribal dynamics, refuge, protection, and untouchability developed later as a consequence of that separation.
That's the argument. The sources provide a parallel example from Welsh law, noted by the scholar Seebholm, which distinguished between tribesmen of Cymric blood and non-tribesmen or strangers, called Altud, who had a different social and legal position.
So this idea of differentiating and segregating non-tribal outsiders wasn't unique to India. Similar structures existed elsewhere.
It suggests so. The sources also discuss how primitive society initially had mechanisms for absorbing non-tribesmen, a kind of rule of adoption, where living together on common territory could eventually replace blood ties as the basis for community.
But that disappeared.
But this rule, Ambedkar argues, disappeared later, which would have reinforced the distinction between the settled tribes and the broken men who remained outside the fold, making their segregated status more permanent.
The sources even speculate about the Nagas, possibly a non-Aryan people, some of whom may have become untouchables. They note a distinction between northern Nagas who adopted Sanskrit and southern Nagas who retained Tamil or Dravida languages.
Which just adds another layer to the picture of ancient social dynamics, highlighting the interactions between different linguistic and tribal groups and processes of assimilation or resistance.
Okay, now let's turn to the concept of defilement and segregation. Because living separately as broken men might explain the physical segregation, but it doesn't necessarily explain the concept of being inherently untouchable or polluting, does it?
That's a fair point. The sources discuss how primitive society did have notions of ceremonial uncleanliness. Certain persons or objects were considered sacred and therefore dangerous or polluting to the profane, requiring segregation. As the source quotes the idea, the profane must keep away from the sacred, so the kindred must keep away from the non-kindred. This kind of links back to the tribal segregation of broken men.
And Hindu law, like in the Manusmriti, also outlines rules about defilement, like certain things making food unacceptable or periods of impurity after a death in the family.
True. But the crucial point, emphasized by the sources drawing on Ambedkar, is that these forms of pollution in Hindu law were typically temporary. They required specific purification rites after the prescribed period ended. This is fundamentally different from the permanent, inherent, incurable pollution associated with untouchability.
Right. So while general notions of purity and pollution existed, they don't fully explain that unique, permanent state of being untouchable.
And this is where Ambedkar introduces his most controversial idea about a specific historical development that he believes cemented untouchability: the beef-eating theory.
Okay, this one sounds provocative.
It is. This theory posits that a significant root of untouchability lies in the historical conflict and rivalry between Brahmanism and Buddhism, particularly centered around the practice of eating beef.
So Ambedkar, through the sources, tackles the question head on. Did Hindus never eat beef? And the analysis presented is quite surprising, isn't it?
It really is. There's evidence that seems to support the idea that beef was taboo early on, like misinterpreting the Rig Veda's term agnya, which Ambedkar argues means not to be slaughtered for sacrifice, not never to be killed,
Yeah.
and citing the Buddhist stance against wanton slaughter, plus an embargo in later texts like the Apastamba Dharma Sutra.
Yeah.
But the sources present powerful evidence against the idea that Brahmins or Hindus never ate beef historically. They show that ancient texts actually prescribe cow slaughter for specific occasions like honoring guests, performing certain sacrifices, and especially for rituals like Shraddha, rites for deceased ancestors.
Even legal authorities like Manu, dated by Buller to the 2nd century AD, apparently considered cow killing only a minor sin if done without good reason. Yajnavalkya, another important legal scholar, had a similar attitude.
And the sources provide incredibly vivid, almost graphic details from the ancient texts about the actual ritual of animal sacrifice. They describe leading the animal 3 times around the fire, the specific mantras used, cutting entrails that resembled an owl, directions given to the slaughterers, even specific rules for distributing parts of the carcass like the neck flesh and left lobe going to the slaughterer, who was told to present it to a brahmana if they weren't one themselves.
These details aren't just morbid trivia, are they? They're concrete, textual evidence presented by Ambedkar to prove that cow sacrifice and subsequent beef consumption were indeed a part of historical Brahmanical and Hindu practice, directly contradicting the later idea that the cow was always sacred and beef eating was always taboo for Brahmins.
Precisely. This historical evidence is absolutely crucial for his theory.
Now, the Buddhist attitude was different. They prohibited wanton slaughter and animal sacrifice. But the sources note that Buddhist bhikshus, the monks, did eat meat, provided it met certain conditions like being unseen, unheard, unsuspected, meaning they didn't witness the animal being killed specifically for them.
Right, so the Buddhist prohibition was more against the act of killing, especially for sacrifice, not necessarily against consuming meat if it was acquired without causing harm oneself or commissioning it.
Okay, here's the critical controversial pivot in Ambedkar's theory. Why did Brahmins stop eating beef and eventually become vegetarians? The source suggests it wasn't primarily due to ethical reasons or direct Buddhist influence, making them adopt vegetarianism out of respect for animal life.
Instead, he proposes it might have been influenced by emerging theories like transmigration of souls, which could make animal flesh seem like human flesh, thus potentially undermining the Brahmin's unique claim to receive sacrificial meat. But more importantly and strategically, he argues it was a move to differentiate themselves from the Buddhists and reclaim their priestly authority in a competitive religious landscape.
So by declaring the cow sacred and abandoning beef eating, they could position themselves as having a higher standard of purity than the Buddhists, who still ate meat, and certainly higher than groups who continued to eat beef.
And this is where he links it back to the broken men. These segregated groups, living outside the village, they might have been among the last to convert from earlier practices, perhaps clinging to remnants of Buddhism, or simply continuing their traditional dietary habits, which included eating beef. When the Brahmins made the cow sacred and beef eating a sacrilege, the broken men who continued this practice were then branded as untouchable, precisely because they committed this profound, newly defined sacrilege.
So the eating to gain religious ground. This turned the already segregated broken men into untouchables because they continued a practice now deemed utterly polluting.
It's a powerful, interconnected argument. It grounds the origin of untouchability not in race or occupation, but in specific historical processes involving tribal dynamics, segregation, religious rivalry, and dietary practices.
Finally, the sources help us place the emergence of untouchability on a historical timeline by looking at different texts and travelers' accounts.
Right. The Manusmriti, dated by the scholar Buller to around the 2nd century AD, contains a passage saying there are only 4 varnas and no 5th. The source notes this passage is enigmatical, suggesting maybe a controversy about whether certain groups fit into the Chaturvarnya, the 4-varna system. Crucially, based on Manu's text overall, the source concludes that in the 2nd century AD, there was no untouchability as we understand it today.
Okay, so not in the 2nd century. Then we jump forward to the account of the Chinese Buddhist traveler Fa Hien, who visited India around 400 AD. He notes the Chandalas, a specific low-status group living separately from the main population.
A sign of segregation, certainly. And then Banapada, an Indian writer from the 7th century AD, provides even more direct evidence. He describes an untouchable girl, a matanga, and explicitly states that she might not be touched.
Might not be touched.
Yeah, the quote in the sources is very evocative, describing her beauty but noting that, like spirit, she might not be touched. Like a letter, she gladdened the eyes alone.
That specific description from the 7th century text is concrete proof, isn't it? The concept of physical untouchability, of person's mere touch being polluting, was firmly established by that time.
It seems so. Synthesizing this textual evidence, Ambedkar's analysis suggests that untouchability, in the sense of a permanently polluting group whose touch must be avoided, emerged sometime between the 2nd century AD, Manu, and the 4th century AD, Fayan, and was clearly present by the 7th century AD, Banapada.
The sources also discuss the various terms used in ancient texts. Antya, Antyaja, Antivas, and Baja groups considered impure or outside the main Varna system, while it's hard to definitively equate all these with the modern term untouchable, asprasha.
They link them to the broader historical concept of impure groups and segregation existing earlier. And one final, perhaps surprising point from the sources, there's evidence of mutual shunning.
Mutual.
Yeah. While Brahmins and other upper castes shunned untouchables, there are also observations from writers noting that untouchables themselves might shun Brahmins.
That challenges the simple idea of a one-way hierarchy based purely on purity, doesn't it? It suggests a more complex dynamic of separation, maybe even a form of resistance or alternative status definition within the excluded groups themselves.
It's a reminder that even within systems of severe oppression, social dynamics can be layered and, well, surprising.
So to quickly reiterate Ambedkar's groundbreaking theory from the sources, untouchability is not based on race. It originated with broken men from different tribes living segregated outside settled villages, and it was cemented and defined as a form of permanent pollution largely through a religious conflict over beef eating, when Brahmins sacralized the cow and branded those who continued the practice as sacrilegious and untouchable.
It's a really compelling, evidence-driven historical argument that fundamentally reinterprets the origins of this deeply entrenched social division.
Wow. Okay. We've gone from the soaring, millennia-old ritual of crowning monarchs in Europe, steeped in gold and religious symbolism, to Dr. Ambedkar's painstaking, often difficult analysis of the historical roots of social division, degradation, and the profound exclusion of untouchability in India. It feels like a vast distance separates these topics, but there are some incredibly potent threads connecting them, aren't there?
At their core, yeah. Both sets of sources show us societies grappling with the same fundamental human challenge. How do you create social order? How do you define who's in and who's out? Who gets status and power? Who's excluded? And how are those definitions made real and maintained over time?
You see the contrast so clearly. In Europe, the elaborate rituals of coronation, the anointing, the investiture, the homage they're used to elevate an individual, grant them this unique, almost sacred status legitimized by church and state.
While in the Indian context, as analyzed by Ambedkar, the denial of ritual, specifically the Upanayana, was used as a powerful tool to degrade and exclude groups, like the Shudras, from higher status categories. One system uses ritual for inclusion and elevation to the top. The other uses its absence for exclusion and degradation to the bottom.
There's also that fascinating contrast in legal systems mentioned. The sources touch on the fluidity in Roman legal history, where the disabilities placed on the plebeians, a lower social class, were gradually removed over time, allowing for some social mobility and integration.
Compare that to the picture painted by Ambedkar of the Brahmanic legal framework, which, as it developed, became increasingly rigid. Maintaining and entrenching that fixed distinction between the Trivarnanikas, the three twice-born Varnas, and the Shudras. It highlights how legal systems can either facilitate change or really rigidly maintain existing hierarchies.
And in both contexts, religious beliefs and practices are just central to defining these social boundaries and status. In Europe, it's the anointing representing divine sanction, the use of sacred objects like the Regalia and the Stone of Destiny.
In India, it's the significance of the Upanayana thread as a marker of eligibility for sacred knowledge, the powerful taboo around beef eating, the sacralization of the cow. Religion in both cases provides a powerful framework for concepts of purity, status, belonging, though applied in opposite ways, right? To elevate and include at the peak, or to brand as impure and exclude at the base.
And the historical conflicts we saw in both sets of sources, the tensions between European monarchs and the church or parliament reflected in the coronation ritual, or those feuds between Brahmins and Shudra kings or other Kshatriyas that Ambedkar details, they show that these questions of status and authority weren't just theoretical, they were battled over, intertwined with questions of who had access to ritual and validation.
It just reinforces that social order is often the outcome of historical power struggles, legitimized and maintained through these symbolic means.
This whole deep dive, especially the work of Dr. Ambedkar, it really speaks to the power and also the challenge of historical inquiry itself. The historical association source includes that great line, "It is good to be unsettled, but then it is better to profit from being unsettled."
Yeah, and Surjendra Sarkar's famous remark from 1937, mentioned in the sources, about searching archives and finding material that unsettles many settled facts.
That perfectly captures what Ambedkar does, doesn't it? He takes these deeply settled facts like the idea the Aryan arrival was a racial conquest, that the four Varnas always existed in their fixed hierarchy, that Hindus never ate beef, and by meticulously examining the historical texts, he completely unsettles them.
His work is just a masterclass in critical thinking and questioning assumptions. He didn't accept the received narrative. He went back to the primary sources and reevaluated the evidence with a different lens, one that was inherently skeptical of the justifications for inequality.
It also brings to mind the difficulty of interpreting historical sources, as mentioned by Rabbi Judah in the Talmud, quoted in the Historical Association source. One who translates a text literally is a liar. One who adds anything to it is a blasphemer.
A profound statement for anyone dealing with historical texts. It highlights that delicate balance needed respecting the original text without adding your own biases, but also recognizing that a purely literal translation without context or understanding can mislead. It takes real skill and honesty to navigate that.
And, as the source points out, failing to engage with history critically or being afraid of what you might find can lead to intellectual dishonesty or being frightened of history itself because it might challenge comfortable preconceived notions about the past or the present.
Understanding the full, often uncomfortable complexity of how societies have constructed status and division in the past is essential, precisely because those historical legacies continue to shape the world we live in today.
So we've taken a really deep dive today into some incredibly rich and, in different ways, challenging source material. We've explored the elaborate ancient rituals used to crown European monarchs and the profound, painful history of the Indian caste system and untouchability, guided by the incisive analysis of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
We've seen how different societies, despite vast geographical and cultural distances, have wrestled with these fundamental human questions of social order: who belongs, who holds power, and how status is defined and maintained over time.
And how potent symbols, elaborate rituals, shared narratives, or their deliberate denial and manipulation have been absolutely central to building and maintaining those structures of inclusion, and often deep exclusion.
And understanding these historical systems isn't just, an academic exercise in looking backward. It helps us recognize how structures of privilege and disadvantage can become incredibly deeply embedded in societies, shaping lives for centuries, and how resilient they can be to change.
It really leaves you thinking. Even in societies today that explicitly reject hereditary privilege or formal caste systems, how do we still create and reinforce social hierarchies? And picking up on Ambedkar's point about modern experts, how do contemporary experts function in our landscape? Do they sometimes, unintentionally or otherwise, form a new kind of exclusive class or caste based on access to specialized knowledge?
That's a great question. And how does understanding the complex, sometimes uncomfortable historical roots of social division, like Ambedkar's theory, linking untouchability to religious conflict over food? How does that equip you, the listener, to identify, challenge, and perhaps even help dismantle contemporary inequalities or misunderstandings in your own world?
Powerful questions to sit with. We hope this deep dive is giving you a new lens through which to view how status, belonging, and power are constructed and contested across human history, and maybe even in the world around you today.